Great, Glenn. Thanks for upstaging me already. Okay. You will have noted in the subject guide that Kate McClymont was actually advertised to potentially be speaking today. Unfortunately, you get me for the whole hour as B-grade journalist representative. I should say that while I am a PhD student in name, I am a journalist by trade, although I do qualify that by saying that I am a business journalist. And the reason I say that is because I have undertaken previous experience with work experience in news journalism, but the experience was quite so scary that I decided I just didn't have the personality for it. My work experience, for those who are locals, it will be of interest, was with the Illawarra Mercury. And we are, bearing in mind that we are going back over a decade ago now. So the Illawarra Mercury of today, I imagine, is quite different from what it was then. And for fear of committing the mortal sin of telling stories when I should be just getting on with it, my introduction to journalism, news journalism, with the Illawarra Mercury, my first job was a death knock. So went out with a journalist, and to me she seemed quite young, even though I was quite young at the time as well. It was from memory, and the details are scant because it is going back over a decade ago now, but from memory the story was a teenage boy had actually been fatally injured in the process of a motorboat accident, and I believe he was swimming at the time, and you can draw the conclusions of what actually happened. So we walked up to this house and we knocked on the door, and I was probably all of about 18 at the time, praying desperately that these people would not answer the door because I felt so incredibly uncomfortable to be there. I think it was the day after their son's death. This journalist knocks on the door, there's no answer. I'm very silently relieved. She then writes on the back of her business card a little message saying, "Can you please contact me? I'd like to talk about the death of your son," and puts it under their door. We start walking down the driveway and I'm thinking, I don't know if I'm really cut out for this kind of work. We then walk up the driveway of the next door neighbour's house, at which point, being inquisitive and trying to be a good work experience student, I say to her, "So why are we going next door? Are you trying to get another perspective on this story?" And she says, "No, it was the neighbour whose motorboat ran over the next door neighbour's son." At which point, I'm still getting chills now because I was quite horrified and thinking, I really hope they don't answer the door now, which they didn't, and she did the same thing. She put the card under the door and we left. Incidentally, the second job that I had to go out on was a hostage situation where a father actually had a shotgun and he was holding his wife and children hostage. And as I was leaving the newsroom, the editor said to me, "I hope you've got life insurance." And I thought he was just being funny and trying to, lighten the situation a bit, and I just chuckled and said no. And he looked very seriously and said, "Then keep your head down in the back of that car." And I just thought, no, this is not for me. So that's why I qualify it when people say, "What do you do for a living?" I say, "Oh, I'm a journalist, a business journalist." And so probably some of that experience has informed the work, the research that I've done to date, and informs what I'd like to talk about today. So in the second piece of false advertising, because obviously I'm not Kate, I'm actually throwing out the subject that was advertised for today to some extent. While I'm not going to talk about corruption per se, I want to play with these words and maybe talk a little bit more about corruption of truth. Start questioning what is truth, particularly in media reporting, and what about the malleability of truth for self-interest? How do we respond to that, particularly in crisis situations? And obviously, as Glenn mentioned, my work is quite controversial that I'm doing for my PhD, given the sensitivities of the topic. But I want to draw on some of that today. My focus of late has been very much on police responses to mental health consumers who are in crisis. But I still have this overriding interest in how the media then responds to those incidents when they turn fatal and how they report them. And so that's what I want to talk about today. How do we, as citizens, ethically respond to the way that the media report about crisis situations? I think it's important in particular to start asking questions, because while there's been a lot of work done, particularly in Australia, about the potential impact, and you would have heard terms maybe like media effects, very much around violence and moral panics. While there's been work done in that area, there's been less work done about the nature and the extent of that reporting and thereby the flow-on effects of that. So I think it's important that we start asking questions about how media go about getting a story and how they frame a story in particular. And for anyone who has spoken to me outside of tutorials, you'll probably get the impression that I'm very much an advocate of critical engagement and critical thinking, and I guess that's what I'm really trying to push today, is that I think there are ethical responsibilities for journalists, and I want to talk about those, but there's also ethical responsibilities and ethical imperatives for us as consumers of media. In terms of crisis situations, like the ones that I'm studying with police-involved shootings of mentally ill individuals, the media very much become a moral arbiter. There is a breach left by these sorts of incidents, and the media step in as the dominant voice in which to restore order and to cast a narrative around these events. And I want us to start unpacking that and start thinking critically about it rather than accepting it as truth. So I guess while I'm not talking specifically about corruption and barriers to truth today, I do want to play with these ideas of truth and of ethical response and of ethical action. So in beginning, it's probably worth just reiterating that so far as an observer, I've noted that the course is very much focused on deconstructing ideological discourses around government apparatuses and government institutions, but I think it's important that we also do that around media. And it's important for a number of reasons. For anyone who is interested in this kind of topic, this is a great little book. I don't necessarily agree with everything that's said in it, but it is a good book as a thought starter. It's called Listening Beyond the Echoes, Media Ethics and Agency in an Uncertain World by Nick Couldry. Sorry?
Can you say it slower?
Say it slower, yes. Listening Beyond the Echoes.
Put it on the document camera.
There we go. Oh, it's not very clear, the bottom but if you at least get Listening Beyond the Echoes, Nick Couldry, he's from the UK, and it should be in most libraries. In this book, Nick Couldry actually says, many contemporary societies and the whole world system are profoundly mediated, yet their media institutions are profoundly unaccountable. Media narratives pervade private and public space. Indeed, media are the main institutional sites where representations of social life get made. So much so that media freedom is widely regarded as a basic necessity for democracy. Yet neither the ethical responsibility nor the democratic accountability of media institutions is the subject of regular and open public debate, let alone effective practice. And I guess this is the premise from which I'd like to start today. And I want us to consider some questions. And I should say, as a bit of a disclaimer, if you've come for answers and you've come for resolution on this issue, you're going to be dissatisfied at the end of this hour. What I really want to do is start opening up questions and getting us to think about those questions. And so in the Q&A, while I'm happy to take questions, I'm also happy to field people's thoughts about this issue, because I don't think that this is necessarily an easy issue to tackle or an easy response to provide. It's a very complex issue. But I want us to start thinking about, as I said, the notion of truth as a regulative ideal. I also want us to start thinking about truth as a malleable concept, something that can be manipulated for the purpose of self-interest. And if that's the case, how do we reconcile that with the importance of truth in some sort of universal sense? What does media ethics seek to protect, if not truth? And how do we define a universal truth? What should ethical accountability be measured against with regards to the media? Are there other virtues beyond truth? And I'm thinking here about things like accuracy, compassion, sensitivity, if you go back to my stories at the start. Are there other virtues that also serve this purpose beyond truth? Then I want us to also think about how we can live ethically with and through the media. How do media institutions, if they do, and this is open for debate, contribute to the conditions of ethical action? Are there combinations of images and words that contribute negatively to the world we share? And how can we begin to formulate an ethics of image and word and an ethics of the media? I guess what I'm asking for is a critical eye or a critical turn towards media practice. And I realise that already there is likely a healthy scepticism of the media. And it's interesting, if you look at the Australian Journalistic Association Code of Ethics, it actually says that accountability engenders trust, which leads me to question, if that's the case, what's happened to accountability? Because we seem to have this innate distrust of media. So going back to Caldry's statement before, the media undeniably has a huge influence in terms of shaping the world we live in, our perceptions of it, and what is contestable. They play a very important role in defining and demarcating what can be said and what cannot be said, what can be shown and what cannot be shown. And there's any number of crisis events or crisis situations, if you like, that we can turn to as evidence of that. September 11 being a good one. Dissenting voices like Noam Chomsky were very much removed from press coverage. We also had issues over the showing of dead bodies or people jumping from the towers. So there's very much, as I said, a moral arbitration going on. The media acts as a moral arbiter. They define what can and cannot be said. So the media process in that respect can never be separated from questions of power. It's interesting because in response to all of that, we have these mediated images which are always held up to be irrefutable evidence of things. Glenn mentioned that I did some work around the JFK assassination. The Zapruder film, for those who are familiar with it, was held up as this piece of irrefutable evidence. It was evidence of a lone assassin. Yet that piece of evidence was broken down into still frames. The still frames were put into a different order from what the running of the footage actually showed. It was appropriated by Life magazine in that way. It was then reappropriated by the Warren Commission to produce a different narrative about the assassination, and then once again appropriated by Oliver Stone to produce yet another different historical narrative about that same event. So we need to start questioning if an image is meant to be a window on reality, if it's meant to be irrefutable evidence of something that's happened, how can several different sources or institutional apparatuses take it and turn it into something that serves their self-interests and to support a different historical truth or a different truth about an event? In terms of that, it's important to note that images do not necessarily hold an inherent truth. We need to go back to the processes of media production. And in that respect, all of our images, all of our media narratives are mediated. They are subjected to specific selection and processes of editing, okay? And that's not done by people who have no bias, who have no agendas, who have no ideological beliefs behind what they do. So we need to bear that in mind. In terms of media ethics, obviously there are codes of ethics in Australia that dictate what journalists, well, they don't dictate, I'll take that back. They're guidelines, because they're self-regulatory, okay? In Australia, we don't have legislation which says a journalist can or cannot do X or Y. These are guidelines by which they should live by and practice by, okay? In terms of journalists, there's a series of those codes for broadcast, for print, etc., etc. There's also the Australian Press Council has a set of guidelines or practices for journalists. And in terms of what I want to talk about today, there's yet another set of guidelines around the reporting of mental illness, okay? But none of them are very specific and none of them are restrictive in the sense that they have an enforcement behind them and they have some sort of penalty behind them for not adhering to them. It's very much self-regulatory, so that plays into it as well. As I said, there's been a bit of work done around academia and looking at media processes and production. But in terms of public debate, this has been wanting, very much so. There's potentially 4 trends, though, that have started to bring this to light, this issue of media ethics. And you probably would have seen a lot of this come out in the media itself, ironically. There's been a lot of talk about journalism, I don't know if anybody's heard of that term before, essentially where journalists will take pre-constructed media releases and repeat them verbatim as their news reports. When I did first start as a business journalist, we had a competitor who didn't have a great deal of credibility about their reporting, but their publisher knew who to shake hands with and whose pocket to dip into, without being too crude about it. And I remember reading a news article one day in this competitor's magazine and thinking, this sounds really familiar. And it was so familiar to the point that I thought they'd actually ripped off one of my stories. So I went and did some digging and then found the press release which I'd been sent about this issue and compared it, and it was repeated verbatim. Now, while some people would say, well, there's no problems with that, the problem I had with it was that the journalist had put their byline on it. So they had their name to it. So anyone reading that story would think that that person had gone and researched it and looked for counterpoints and done some fact-checking and then written a story about it, when they hadn't. They'd just committed this sin of journalism, if you like. So the problem with that is, as I say, it often fails to look at counterpoints or different viewpoints. There's also been a good deal of emphasis, particularly lately, on the threat of online news mediums and the rise of the citizen journalist. Anybody who's gone onto the Sydney Morning Herald website will often see a call for action for people who might have footage or photos of events. Please send them in. So suddenly we have citizen journalists who are taking footage out on the street and sending it to news organisations, and news organisations appropriating those sorts of images for their own media narratives. The other one is the impact of privacy and freedom of information legislation. What I should say is that while I probably sound very critical of media, and I do make some generalisations about it, it is important to remember that not all journalists are unethical. And there are some journalists out there who are trying to do the right thing and to promote and produce quality journalism. So in that respect, journalists have said quite a lot about privacy and FOI legislation, and also the fear of litigation as being quite restrictive in their abilities to actually hold other power structures up to account in the community. Very much this fear of litigation over defamation in particular. And there's been quite a few instances in recent times which we can point to, no better than Mercedes Kirby, and also Judy Davis and those sorts of events. But we also have other incidences like the incident in 2008 where the Federal Police raided the home of a Canberra Times journalist seeking material which that journalist had used in the construction of a story about defence intelligence. So journalists are now under the threat of these kinds of legislations and strictures in their everyday work practices. The final point that I'd probably make in terms of trends which have started to bring media ethics to the fore in the public arena is obviously checkbook journalism, which I don't think is a really appropriate term because I don't know how much journalism really goes into it. When a media outlet is starting to pay for sources for exclusive rights to their information, you have to start questioning, why do people need to be paid to tell the truth as they see it? The other thing that is quite concerning is, in terms of those payment arrangements, we don't always know what conditions have been placed around that agreement, whether the interviewer has been told you can ask this but you can't ask that, whether the questions have been pre-agreed before the actual interview. So there's something to be said about transparency here, and this is what I want to start to move towards. How do we hold media accountable? If they live and work and practice in a self-regulatory environment and there's this inherent distrust of media, then how do we move to a position where we can start to respond to those issues and start to address those? I guess the takeout from that is that media do not just report events, but they're active agents in framing and shaping the socio-political environment in which we live. They contribute significantly to the process of where and how problems are defined. The problem is that media reports quite often are here today and gone tomorrow, but very much what I've found in terms of reporting about fatal mental health crisis interventions, for example, is that while the report is here today and gone tomorrow, the impact or the effects of that report can be quite damaging and lasting to families, to friends, to survivors of incidents, to anyone involved with it. And in the case of my research, I'm looking at an event which happened over 10 years ago and the family is still very much affected by that, particularly because the images were so graphic and so repetitively played. I don't even know where ethics comes into that particular case study. So, just to give some sort of a context to this, because I want to move on and start looking at fatal mental health crisis interventions as I define them, and the impact of media reports around those events. Crisis situations, quite often in regards to media research, are big events. You know, they're the September 11s, they're the JFK assassinations. I think there's a lot more richness in actually looking at extraordinary events which touch ordinary lives and which impact on people at a very local level. These are the people that could be living next door to you, you know, and this is really important in terms of community engagement and community critiquing of the media. By their very nature, fatal mental health crisis interventions, and to give you an example so you know what I'm talking about when I say that, is everyone familiar with Ronnie Levy's shooting on Bondi Beach? That's the sort of situation we're talking about, where somebody who has a mental health crisis comes into contact with the police, and unfortunately that event ends up in a fatal situation where the mentally ill individual is shot. You would note that this has been quite a talking point in the press, particularly around tasers recently. But by their very nature, fatal mental health crisis interventions attract media attention and publicity, just as they also attract competing discourses about culpability, perceptions of risk and dangerousness in relation to mental illness, and trauma and the limits of traumatic recovery. For the broader public then, knowledge of these incidents is typically made apparent via their media coverage. This is of great significance when you consider that a recent study of Australians revealed that while 90% of respondents believe mental illness to be an issue of significance in Australia, most did not have a clear understanding of mental illness and mental disorders. Now, for the most part, the meaning frameworks constructed by mainstream news media remain highly mediated, as I said. And in the context of reports about fatal police-involved shootings of mentally ill individuals or people who are in psychiatric crisis, they've conventionally adopted news frames, or what some theorists have referred to as media templates, that presuppose an inherent causal link between mental illness and violence. What we get is very much images that suggest this is what they look like, this is what mentally ill people look like. Mentally ill people are violent, they are unpredictable, they are uncontrollable. The problem with this, as Morris aptly points out, is that the misinformation typically perpetuated by these sorts of stereotypes can be so pervasive and powerful that we accept certain elements without question as representing the truth. And the truth, if we want to get to the heart of it, is that more often than not, mental health consumers are victims of violence and victims of self-harm more often than they are the perpetrators of violence. This point about accepting this unquestioningly is highlighted further by Wall, who says it is not simply that the image of people with mental illness as violent and criminal appears so often and in so many different sources. It is that this image is characteristic of media portrayals. When one sees or reads about a person with a mental illness in the media, it is more likely that the person will be shown as criminal or dangerous than in any other way. The perpetuation, and worse still, the acceptance of such misconceptions has broader and significant implications, given that the main reasons for poor relationships between police and mental health consumers is often the result of fear and stigma, of which police are not immune, I should add. There's quite often a perception in some of the work that I've been doing that once a police officer dons their uniform, they become something that is superhuman. They're not like you and I. They are. They're still like you and I, even though they've got that uniform on. So police are not immune to this, and media treatment of mental health crisis incidents is a contributing factor, given its tendency towards perpetuating inappropriate stereotypes. Now, that's actually a summation that's come from the final report of the Mental Health Crisis Intervention Ad Hoc Advisory Group. They always like putting long names on these sorts of reports. So in short, media portrayal is viewed as an important element in forming and influencing negative community attitudes towards mental health issues. To go back to Morris refers to this point in his analysis of the media's interest in mental health related issues, claiming that when it comes to defending definitions of newsworthiness, and that's another thing that we should open up for public debate, and the inclusion of what is often poorly constructed mental health media content, instead of openly recognising the profitability of such content, the public's need to know is cited as being the most salient aspect. Yet another term that I think we should open up for debate. Whether the need was there in the public domain in the first place or whether it was created by the media is a point of contention. So in terms of these media templates, there's quite often a number of themes, I guess, that come about. Quite often there is talk about the mental health consumer as being dangerous. You'll often hear derogatory terms like psycho, lunatic, nut, schizo. There's an increasing trend towards talking about training of police officers. There's also an increasing trend, as I said, towards talk about tasers as the silver bullet solution, the magic key to this situation. But more often than not, there's also talk about the use and abuse of police power and of lethal force. And I want to show you just a little snippet, well, it's actually about 10 minutes snippet, of a recent episode of Four Corners. I don't know if anybody saw the lethal force episode of Four Corners. Quite interesting. I have some potentially controversial things to say about it, but I want to show that just as this example of the rhetoric about police power and the use and abuse of lethal force, and maybe we can open that up to some discussion in the Q&A. So, bear with me. Oh.
Perhaps if all frontline officers were better trained, 3 tragic deaths this past year would not have occurred. On June the 2nd, in Armidale, New South Wales, a 24-year-old man, Elijah Holcombe, was shot dead.
He was quite a character, had a great sense of humour, yeah, and absolutely adored his friends. If you're his friend, you're his friend for life.
Elijah Holcombe was a country town boy who made good. He was a bright youngster, but suffered from depression during his teenage years. Later, he went to Macquarie University to study psychology.
He was a pacifist, he was a musician, he was a philosopher, he was a thinker, he was such a kind and generous person.
Elijah's parents saw a brilliant future for their son. But in August 2008, when Elijah was living in Sydney, they realised that something was badly wrong. He began to have episodes of paranoia.
I would receive phone calls in the early hours, and he would say, "Mum, I'm at a train station. I've taken money out of the bank. I've got my passport. I'm afraid."
He believed that the police were coming to get him, and this was a whole new scenario.
Elijah had constructed a theory based on clues that only he understood, that he'd be arrested by the police, sent to America, and publicly executed in Los Angeles. But he also had moments of clarity, when he was well aware of his illness and readily complied with the treatment his doctors prescribed. 3 days before he died, in an episode of paranoia, Elijah harmed himself. 2 days later, his father drove him into Narrabri, his hometown, for a doctor's consultation.
I told Elijah that I just had to go to the post office and then to the bank, and that I would be back in a minute. So I went into the post office. Elijah waited in the car. I actually did start to get a bit anxious because I thought I'd been away from the car longer than I intended to be. And I was standing in the queue at the bank, and I looked out the window and saw my car drive past with Elijah at the wheel. And he stopped at the highway and had his indicator on to go around the corner onto the highway, and that was the last time I saw him.
In the next few hours, despite frantic efforts to locate him, Elijah couldn't be found. By mid-afternoon, despite their son's paranoia, Tracey and Jeremy Holcombe went to the police for help. Both parents were specific in what they told the police.
I said, my son's taken off in my car and he's mentally ill, and I'm very worried about it. He's terrified of the police. That's part of his illness at the moment. I said, can you help us find the car? If you can help us find the car, we'll just go and get him and everything will be fine.
Did you ask the police specifically not to approach him?
I did. I asked the police officer not to approach him in public, to call us, and they did not call us.
Elijah's movements over the next few hours are unclear, but his family believes he may have ended up in Armidale, some 280 kilometres away that afternoon, and slept in the car that night. The next morning, in an apparent moment of mental clarity, he walked into Armidale police station.
He presented himself there and said, I think I've done something wrong, I've stolen my dad's car. They worked out who he was, and they told him, no mate, you haven't done anything wrong, but you're not very well, let's take you to hospital. Which they did. He left the hospital against their advice, but he was a voluntary patient, and they told me, the people at the hospital certainly told me that he wasn't aggressive or offensive to anyone, he just left.
What exactly happened next will be explored in detail at a coronial inquiry. What is known is that Elijah entered this cafe in the middle of Armidale, closely followed by a police officer in plain clothes.
I was about to go on my lunch break when a man entered the cafe, running down the hallway very quickly. Seemed scared and rushed. He was running, and he sort of didn't make any eye contact with any of us. He just picked up the knife and took straight off.
Did he say anything?
No, not a word.
I looked up and said, oh, excuse me, because we don't have anyone come into our kitchen, of course, and he just ignored me.
Is that pretty much identical to the knife?
It is, yeah. It was the same serrated edge.
Right, and the same rounded end?
Yeah, identical. And then he picked it up and continued on out. He started running. At that time, I turned and another man was coming down. He was wearing regular clothes as well, except he had a gun inside in a holster.
I wasn't sure what was happening. I confronted him also, excuse me, it's like number two coming through. And he identified himself as police, and he just went straight out the door as well. And we thought, oh, something must be up.
And then he took straight off up, and then following a man. We didn't exactly know what happened at the time, but I started walking up just to see what happened. And about 5 car spaces up, there was a shot, just a single shot.
Eyewitnesses say they heard the officer tell Elijah 2 or 3 times to drop the knife or get down on the ground, and then shot him. Judy Tennant, a contract cleaner in Armidale, saw it happen.
A young man ran past me, and I heard another man that was chasing him say, put the knife down. The police officer was sort of right out in the middle of the lane.
Yes.
There, and I yelled out, no, don't shoot. And right when I was in the middle of that, the gun went off.
Did Elijah at any point threaten the officer with a knife?
No, actually it was quite the opposite. You know, he looked like he was given up and defeated, and he just looked really terrified, and I'm not even sure that he even knew he had the knife in his hand at that point.
Elijah Holcombe had been shot and lay dying in the street from a single bullet wound to the chest. As onlookers from a nearby library and council building stared in disbelief, stunned by what they'd seen, 3 women, 2 of them nurses, who'd been having lunch in a nearby cafe, ran over to help.
When the 3 of you were working to try and help save Elijah's life, what were the police officers doing? Were any of them trying to administer CPR?
No, none of the police officers actually touched the body, and I asked a police officer who is known to me, I said, why are you all standing around watching while my friend and I are here on the ground? And he said, well, she's medically trained and we're not.
The day that had started badly for the Holcombes had ended catastrophically for the police as well as the family. A man with a paranoid fear of the police shot dead by a policeman. At the inquest, questions will be asked about the role of the officers concerned, starting with their failure to reach Elijah's parents when he walked into Armadale Police Station.
I was not contacted when he turned at the police station, or when he went to the hospital, and they were instructed, begged, to contact me.
Questions will also be asked about the officers' apparent failure to take account of Elijah's known paranoia.
If he went through that cafe and saw this guy following him with obviously a gun, and he didn't identify himself as a police officer, I can only imagine that Elijah was absolutely terrified. And I could imagine that even though it was completely out of character for Elijah, that he may have picked up this knife.
None of the witnesses Four Corners has spoken to say the officer tried to de-escalate the situation.
I hear from people that were there that he was yelled at to get to the ground, drop the knife, bang. Shot in the chest, and he fell to the ground with his head on the curb, and some people came to help him, nurses, to give him CPR, and they said there was one man pacing up and down, looking agitated. The guy that had shot him. I don't understand why he did it. I just want to ask him why. Not that it's ever going to bring Elijah back, because he didn't deserve that.
In a statement to Four Corners, New South Wales Police say the shooting of Elijah Holcombe is being investigated independently by the Homicide Squad and oversighted by the Professional Standards Command. This investigation is still underway, and at its conclusion, a report will be provided to the State Coroner. The state with by far the worst record in the country for fatal police shootings is Victoria. 49.
Back up and running again. Clearly these kinds of events are very tragic. They're very sensitive events, and I'm not about to take sides. What I find really interesting, and obviously this is a 10-minute snippet from an hour-long program, but what is interesting is that this program in particular had this fantastic opportunity to incorporate the voices of families and those affected by these events. If you look at print media reports of fatal mental health crisis interventions over the last decade, it is not at all a frequent occurrence that the voices of family members and friends are incorporated into these stories. The media templates either work so that the person is derided as being violent and there is that association inherently between mental illness and violence, or what I'd call a demonisation period, which is then followed by some sense of memorialisation when finally there's stories cast about this person that actually present them as human. But more often than not, the voices of the family and friends who are impacted by this are silenced. They're not included. So here we have a program which starts to incorporate those voices, which is fantastic, but it does so at the expense of context. And it does so at the expense of a voice from the police force. And I know that that is not a comfortable thing to say or is not necessarily the right thing to say. I should probably go back a second and just say when I started my research around this, I very much came at it with a bias. Police are shooting these poor people, they're not trained properly, they're not adequately resourced. Those things are true. But at the same time, I think there needs to be a level of context provided around these incidents. There needs to be a balance between the voices that are heard. So here we have this fantastic opportunity to start educating and start talking about the impact on families, but it's done at the expense of talking about the impact on police officers as well. I might just read you a quick snippet. Actually, I'll just read this is from a paper that I wrote previously. As the Queensland Public Advocates report Preserving Life and Dignity in Distress, Responding to Critical Mental Health Incidents explains, such critical incidents are invariably complex. The person with a mental illness will most likely be highly distressed and fearful of their own safety, may be experiencing paranoia or delusions involving police, and may have a history of contact with law enforcement. Combined with this is the response of the police officer, an officer who may have received only cursory mental health training, who may be fearful for their own safety and that of others on the scene, and who is acutely aware of the potential for violence that exists in dealing with situations of behavioural disturbance. While fatal outcomes to mental health crisis interventions in the form of police-involved shootings of mentally ill individuals are relatively uncommon in Australia, what is troubling is the prevalence of these incidents as a proportion of the total number of fatal police shootings recorded. So if you think about it, if we're giving some context to these sorts of events, police in New South Wales alone now come in contact with 34,000 mental health incidents in a year. That's about 93 incidents a day. And yet we see these sorts of stories being presented as though this is commonplace. And if you conduct focus groups with a lot of mental health consumers, they will talk about an inherent fear of police. I remember going to a symposium for the Schizophrenia Fellowship of New South Wales, and they had the commander of the mental health intervention team from Memphis. And what they're doing is they're providing specialist training for their police officers in the States to respond to these sorts of behavioural disturbances. And at the end, they took a Q&A session, and one lady got up and she said, "My son has schizophrenia and he has told me in his lucid moments, if I have a crisis, Mum, don't call the cops because I'll end up dead." And that is a rhetoric that you hear quite frequently when you're talking with mental health consumers, as I've done with this research. So 34,000 in a year, and this is what's being portrayed as being the common result. I'm not saying that it's a result which should happen, but we're talking about context and balance here. Indeed, strong negative community sentiment towards such adverse incidents involving mental illness can put at risk substantive broader mental health reforms and can also threaten the credibility of police to the potential detriment of subsequent interactions between police and mentally ill individuals. Many police officers never recover from such circumstances and themselves suffer severe psychological problems after such incidents, often for the rest of their lives. Such sentiments were recently expressed by former Detective Inspector with the Victoria Police Rod Porter in an online editorial following the fatal police shooting of 15-year-old Melbourne boy Tyler Cassidy, and I'm pretty sure most people would be aware with that particular event. Porter wrote, "I'm a former copper who once shot a man dead, and I'm also the father of a 15-year-old boy. No police officer joins the force because they want to shoot someone dead. At the time, preserving my own life was the priority. You have to act in what you think is the most appropriate way. But once that happens and the danger is eliminated, you start to question yourself. Was there another option? Could I have done something another way? The fact I was involved in the taking of a life will stay with me until I die." In terms of the Four Corners episode, I should say that I think it was 3 out of the 4 incidents that they covered were still going before a coroner, which leads me to question, how can you start talking to witnesses and putting their stories forward in a show like this, which I think has a strong bias towards laying culpability at the feet of police, when it's still going before a coroner? And I know that there are some mental health advocates who have actually written to the coroner's court seeking clarification on whether that is some kind of legislative breach. I don't know. Somebody in the audience may have some insight on that. But it leads me to question, why is it that quite often media have these opportunities to go the extra step and they have an educational imperative? There's an opportunity there to educate about issues like mental illness and responses to mental illness and police training and resources, but more importantly, I think, an imperative to talk about systemic failings. In each of these instances, the person who was shot had been in contact with the mental health system and there had been some failure of care leading up to their actual shooting. And the Four Corners episode goes so far as to say there's failings, but it doesn't go any further. When we do have stories which start to talk about the failings of the mental health system, this is the kind of headline we're presented with. Now, if you didn't read further than the headline, I think you would consider that to be a very different story from what it actually turns out to be. It's actually a story about a report that was released talking about failures of the mental health system and the negative consequences of that in terms of, obviously, homicides from people who are in a psychotic state. But mentally ill set free to murder. Very different story. So when those sorts of opportunities are taken up, they're taken up very crudely. Probably the most recent example where the media has actually started to try and present some sort of balance was in relation to the Waterloo murders, which happened recently in Randwick. And we started to see, lo and behold, the Daily Telegraph actually producing stories which tried to balance out and start educating about mental illness. But it's very rare. So this comes back to our questions again that I put forward at the start. If media have this opportunity and this educational imperative, they have this opportunity to educate about such important issues and they fail to do so, is there anything we can do? Is there anything we should do to be engaged as a community, to be engaged as media consumers, to take up that baton and start pressing for those sorts of reports rather than the templated narratives that we keep getting? How do we define also an ethical framework for the media that compels them to take up these functions, but at the same time bearing in mind that the media does do good quite often, that doesn't restrict them in terms of their ability to take to task, to take to account other power structures that should be called into question, for example, in terms of corruption? How do we also address this idea of press freedom and in the public interest? How do we define it? Who defines it? And how do we retain it without causing the harm and the negative consequences that some of these reports can generate? How do we engage the media to be ethically reflexive, but how do we, more importantly, also become ethically reflexive ourselves to the media process? How do we start to question what we need to know, what our right to know is? And how do we start to question our own assumptions? And I'll leave you with a quote which I found, which I thought was quite good. If I can find it. This is from Couldry again. If we are serious about opening up our political language to transformation, then an essential step is to open up for discussion and criticism our own assumptions too, to create the space for listening to others who start from a different position. For the requirement to listen to the voices of others is precisely a value of effective democracy itself, provided we face honestly the necessity to live with others who start from different positions from us and are motivated by values we may not share. Thank you.
Okay, so the popular image we have of the journalist is typically those presented in movies is of the journalist who is the truth-seeking apostle who is fighting the forces of evil and darkness and probably alcoholism on his or her, generally on his quest to the truth. And if you see the films like All the President's Men, you will see Woodward and Bernstein eventually following the paper trail which brings down a President of the United States. If you watch the last frames of the film, the conspiracy film 3 Days of the Condor, he's on the run from the CIA, and the CIA want to bring him in, which is probably code for we'd like to bring you in and shoot you. The last shot is of the victim going into the New York Times, the building of the New York Times, as though going into the building will itself yield some truth and the CIA will be defeated. If you've watched the recent Russell Crowe film, and I hope you haven't, State of Play, you will see the untidy, unkempt, irascible anti-hero fight against the forces of evil and darkness and his own ego.
The UK miniseries is better.
Thank you. And eventually bring down a corrupt system, and even slices of other shows. So like the recent series, The Circuit, you've got the gay journalist working in Broome who is working away behind the scenes to try and bring about truth. So we generally ascribe to journalists this quest for truth, and what they write is in fact true. And that these people are our missionaries, as it were, to bring some sort of truth to the chaotic world of evil and darkness out there. But, you know, as we know, the news is a construction. If you go home tonight and watch the first item on the Channel 10 news, it'll probably be Dog Bites Man or Man Bites Dog in Blacktown. You'll then go over at 6 o'clock to Channel 7 and Channel 9 news, and the Man Bite Dog or Dog Bites Man story may or may not appear. It'll be something else. You go to SBS News, it'll be something about the Gaza or Kazakhstan or, you know, something in Siberia, so it'll be global, and by about 10 past 7, you might get Man Bite Dog or Dog Bites Man, probably in Algeria. And then you go to Channel... So, same sorts of people doing the same sorts of things, but presenting a completely different narrative. And to bring this back to the local, if you saw recently the news coverage of the dismissal of a junior manager at Wollongong Council for corruption, and ICAC had been brought in, this was headlined, the first item on Channel 10 News, with a reporter standing above the Centennial Baths, giving a great coverage of this, terrific coverage, and then the Channel 4 coverage was the last item before we went to Amy Taylor giving the sport. So here is the local news within 5k of the building where the event took place, according to a different priority from a news agency which is 70k up the road, which could barely find Wollongong on the map, given that it's more prone to report Dog Bites Man or Man Bites Dog at Blacktown, putting it as number one. Same event, but according to different reality. So, in terms of what Katrina is saying, and in terms of where your questions might go, and I now get to my point, and allow you to ask your questions, is what role then does the media play, or what role should it play? And I'll let you handle the Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Any questions?
Don't hold back.
Comments? Yeah.
Katrina,
I think you have to press. Have we got? Oh, we haven't got our. No mics. Okay.
we're looking there at a clip, the four corners, which is public.
Yeah, you might want to come down the front. It might be easier.
Yeah, or maybe repeat people. Oh no, I go down the front. Get on the TV. No, go down the front. No, come star too. Everyone should have 5 minutes of fame.
Thank you. My 5 minutes of fame. Katrina, what the clip we saw is public broadcasting. A lot of the other media, of course, is commercial, and there are interests of proprietors and shareholders, which also come down to selling newspapers and selling advertising, and so there is a difference. By comparison, we could look at things like 60 Minutes, which I must admit I don't look at, but then you've got something like Chris Masters' The Moonlight State, which blew open corruption in Queensland, and I think Quentin Dempster has also managed to have a similar effect here in New South Wales. So, I mean, perspectives are one thing, but how do you see the difference between the types of media rather than just the medium?
Yep, sure. Types of media. Are you talking between print and broadcast, or are you talking between commercial and government? Commercial and government. Well, if I'm honest, I'm disappointed with government run. I mean, that's a classic example. Four Corners is a program that I think has quite often held credibility for people. And I really watched that episode in particular, which was called Lethal Force, with interest. I should declare my hand somewhat. Earlier in the episode, they actually talked to the New South Wales Police Force about their mental health intervention team, which they're running, which is similar to the Memphis model that I mentioned before. It's specialist training for police officers. And I was actually involved as a research assistant on a program which was evaluating that particular program, which has now passed its trial, and it's now rolling it out over a 5-year period to a number of its police officers. They interviewed several representatives from the MHIT. Interviews went anywhere up to about half an hour. They got about 5 seconds in terms of their coverage. And it was very much, they had their say. They then cut to an academic, and they said to the interviewer said to the academic, "Do you think that what they're doing is enough?" And the academic said, "No, all police officers should be trained," which I don't necessarily disagree with, but I think there's something to be said for context once again, and resource constraints, etc., etc., etc. So in terms of balance, I think that the Four Corners episode was quite disappointing. I think that most people who watched that episode would have expected something different from it. In terms of your commercial channels, well, obviously, as you've mentioned, there are commercial imperatives and commercial interests. And this is one of the things I think is quite difficult, actually, for journalists. I mean, news journalists who are working for, your primetime television channels, or even your mainstream news media or print media, face really tight deadlines, and they face commercial imperatives which are not necessarily movable from their position. They're dictated to them from structures of management, etc., etc. So in terms of their coverage, well, I'll be quite blunt and say it's very sensationalist. It's quite often sensationalist. I mean, the case study that I'm working on is actually a local case study. The images of the event were broadcast very gratuitously, I might add. They were then broadcast repetitively as a promo for the news on that channel. And one of the things that you need to remember is that once these images go out into the public domain, they become almost like public property. Now, the images of that particular event have ended up in training sessions for police. They've ended up in training sessions for mental health nurses. The family has not been contacted to be told that that's happening. The family has not been asked whether they have any objections to that happening. And these are images of a very traumatic event, which is obviously still impacting their lives. And they hear of these sorts of things secondhand. So in terms of the coverage, in terms of commercial television, for example, I think is very akin to print media, commercial print media, in that it is very sensationalist, it uses sensationalist language, it very much sticks to the templates, that these people are either deficient in some way and are victims, or are mentally ill and therefore violent by association. And I mean, I don't know whether that answers your question, but you know, in terms of episodes like this, I'm disappointed, to be perfectly honest, because I think we naturally gravitate towards those sorts of shows like Four Corners, and that to give us the truth, to provide the counter-narrative to the commercial stations.
I mentioned Chris Masters because there is a role for the media to expose corruption.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what I was trying to say before about an educational imperative, and there's an opportunity there for the media to really play a great role in education, just as there is an opportunity for them to lift the lid on corruption. But if I'm perfectly honest about it, I think investigative journalism in Australia is severely wanting. You know, I don't really know if we have that anymore. And I think that, you know, without putting too fine a point on it, these sorts of episodes really reflect that.
Katrina,
Yeah.
can you tell us what the coroner reported on that incident so we can get
It's still going before the coroner. And this is, yeah, the question for everybody else in the satellite campuses was, what did the coroner say about the incident which we actually showed the snippet of from Four Corners? And it's still going before the coroner. This is why I'm asking the question, you know, what's the ethical responsibility of a news outlet or, you know, a program such as Four Corners going and speaking to witnesses before they've actually appeared before a coroner, before this has gone through a coronial process, before it's even gone through an investigation via police structures? Well, hang on one second. Yep. Yeah, come out if you want.
Everyone steps up to it.
I'll forget it by the time I get there.
You need to write your notes.
So Jill, what was your question?
Thank you. I'm just interested in the idea of public interest and what's the balance of importance in terms of rules and regulations that are state or federal bound, and the interest of the public to know what's happened on their streets. I take on board what you say about it, but in terms of, I think public interest, do we all have to wait till some judge tells us what's happened, whereas we've got witnesses in the street? And did Four Corners give the police an opportunity to respond? And in any case, even if they didn't, they could have responded equally through the media. And I'm also terribly interested in the media being responsible for education. Don't we have an education minister who's supposed to provide those sorts of things? So rather than get too political, that's my question. 2 questions, thanks.
2, I thought it was 3 in there, okay. And now I'm confused. Okay, let's start with the easy one. Did Four Corners approach the police for a response? Yes, they did. And you can find their response on the Four Corners website, in fact, and their response was shown in that graphic. The problem is that with these events still going through a coronial process and still going through internal investigations, the police as an institution is bound by its internal protocols to not say anything too explicit about those events because they're still undergoing investigation and they're still going through a coronial process. So yes, they did have an opportunity to respond, and they responded to the full extent that an institution such as the police force would allow them to. In terms of responding through the media, it's not very often that they do. They usually will just put out a bulletin that says what has happened in terms of the event, because obviously, as I said, they're bound by their internal protocols of investigation. Now, what was your other question?
I think the important one is, in terms of those regulations and rules that are already ordain, how do we balance up public interest?
Rules that are ordained, what do you mean by that?
Regulations, like the police have got their rules so news doesn't get out and
Yep.
information doesn't get out. They control their own information, obviously, for their own self-interest.
Yeah.
In terms, I'm sorry, I err on the side of the mother. And how do you balance up public interest in terms of what has been structured, pre-structured for our consumption, information-wise, yeah.
I don't know if I have a response that actually answers your question in terms of, how do we balance public interest? I guess my question is, how do we define public interest? These terms are quite often bandied about in terms of media research and also by the media themselves, that we've reported X event because it's in the public interest or the public has a right or a need to know. But I guess my question is, who is this public and how do we define what is public interest? A situation like this is going to be very different from a situation of corruption, for example. So it's not even about how you define public interest, but I think how you define public interest in respect to particular issues or events. In terms of the media justifying sometimes why they graphically present fatal mental health crisis interventions, they'll say because, the public needs to know what's happening on their street. They need to know that police are not trained adequately, that they need to know that the system is failing and this is what's happening. But I think that still needs to be balanced with the broader context. So I don't know if I have an answer for your question about how we balance public interest. I think that's an issue that we need to open up to public debate. So, sorry. Yes, come on down.
Coming in from Shaune.
Hi, John.
Right. Now, what I think has been missed in this presentation, and I'd like you to try and cover, is the crushing effect of defamation on the revelation of truth, particularly by ordinary citizens expressing honest opinions about what they believe to be corrupt or improper behaviour. The second one, the balance, you didn't, I don't think, cover the police media branch. For example, there's about 30 odd people in the police media branch, which gives them enormous firepower, and the police union can step in when the police are constrained by the Coroner's Act and the procedures that go with it. And finally, the last one is to do with ministerial spin and how this programs the media reaction. And I'll just read one of my verses. Ministers' minders report ministers' wise. Wised up journalists re-spin the lies. Occasionally, by double jeopardy, the truth emerges quite miraculously.
Okay. In 5 minutes or less, that's right. I agree with you that the police are very much well-resourced. I guess the difficulty for me is you've probably asked some questions which are not necessarily the focus of my current research. I guess my research focuses on the very human trauma narratives related to mental health and the impact on those who are on the street when these incidents happen, what impact there is on them. And while I agree that the police are very much well-resourced in terms of their media branch and in terms of the union, I've quite often heard that in terms of individual police officers, they're not represented by those groups. In some instances, I've heard of police officers not even being offered counselling after these sorts of incidents. So I don't know really how to answer your question, to be perfectly honest. And in terms of defamation, yeah, sorry, were you going to say something?
Just going to say, I strongly agree with your view about the lack of backup for the ordinary constable in the street. And in many instances, in my direct experience, these people are thrown on the scrap heap when they desperately needed the support of their force.
Yes, yeah. So I guess in terms of what I've just said, I'm making a distinction between the police force as an institution and as an institutional apparatus versus the individual police officer. And really my interest is about the person who's on the street and what happens to them and how do they get their story told. And I think in some respects, you know, while it's difficult for families, it is, as I said, difficult for individual officers as well, because these are events that devastate their lives, and yet their narratives are not often heard. They are overshadowed by the institutional narrative. And there's a lot to be said for, you know, how do you actually, for example, as an affected family member or a friend or somebody who's just equally engaged from a community level and really passionate and interested about responding to these sorts of incidents, how do you respond to those against a power structure like the police force? And you know, there's been examples where there's been a police shooting happen. The impact has been quite severe in terms of the media coverage. The family has tried to bring some sort of litigation against the media and hasn't been able to do it so, and they've tried to go up against the police force for things like miscarriage of their duty of care, you know, not cordoning off a street, allowing the media in, and it is nigh on impossible to take on a power structure of that size and of that wieldy nature. You know, they do have the resources behind them. In terms of the defamation question, John, can you just repeat what you asked again? Sorry.
In my direct experience, defamation is the best ally of corruption. In other words, if I were to change one thing in my whole career and all of my experiences, it would be the law on defamation, despite the fact that people's reputations can be trashed. But the fact is they are trashed now by the media and by public hearings. But the public good, the greater public good is served by particularly a public figure test and less damages and so on, in order to give people the opportunity of free speech without repression.
John, I'll just give you a couple of... You're right, the defamation laws are quite protective of and restrictive against people talking the truth. And ironically, with the defamation laws as they stand, as I understand them, truth isn't a defence. But I'll give you a couple of examples, both the first two of which were when I was in the health department. When I left the health department when the Greiner government was elected, because I simply couldn't work within the confines of a new government without being sacked. I left work at 6 o'clock on the afternoon before the Unsworth government election, and I came in on Monday morning, and by 10 o'clock, two things had changed. The discourse that we were using had changed. I'd only been at work an hour and a half. Already patients in the hospital where I was working, I was based in Port Campbell Hospital, patients had become consumers, and this was via an informal memo that had come around. So I left patients on the Friday afternoon and I came back on Monday morning within an hour and a half and I saw them as consumers. And for the first time I began to hear the phrase, the bottom line. And it was all about the bottom line. Not really knowing and not really caring for the bottom line, despite the fact that for my staff I was bringing in toilet paper, tissue papers, biros, pencils, etc., etc. Rosemary, please don't take notes. Yeah, now in the context of this, I did a radio interview when Greiner and Peter Collins, who was then the opposition spokesperson on health, were on ABC radio, and they were talking about what they were going to do. And I rang up, and sadly, my identity was revealed to these two gentlemen in the course of my telephone conversation. So I rang up as Concerned of Wollongong, and I wanted to know what their health policies were to people from non-English speaking backgrounds. And I was told that the people of New South Wales really didn't want the fine detail of the policies. They really knew what they wanted, and this would be fixed in the fullness of time. I followed this up with the statement, so in other words, if I'm hearing you correctly, your policies are morally corrupt. It's a long pause at this point, and I can hear the legal brains of Collins and Greiner collectively whirring away. Not long after that, a colleague of mine, who was in charge of developmental disabilities, wrote a letter to the editor of the Illawarra Mercury, or it could have been the Herald, in which he used my words. He called the policies of the Greiner and Collins, the Greiner government's health policies as administered by Peter Collins, as morally corrupt. He sued for defamation and he never recovered. He ended up a very serious mental health case. Not only that, he ended up broken and he ended up broke. I don't know why Greiner and Collins chose to sue him in the press when those words that he used were exactly the same as the ones that I'd used. But later on, I spoke at a public forum in the launch of a sexual assault program dealing with sexual assault prevention in the Arabic-speaking community. Now, the Arabic-speaking community denied that sexual assault or any form of sexual impropriety was occurring in their community, and didn't want this. It was a classic case of negotiating to get this program up and running. And when we did, I gave an off-the-cuff speech, and as you're probably aware, I don't hold back, and I tend to exaggeration, a little bit of hyperbole, and I got a little bit carried away. And at the Migrant Resource Centre where this policy was being launched, I could remember everyone in the room, and at 10 o'clock that night, I couldn't remember the person in the front row. And then I suddenly went cold all over and went, oh, fill in the gap. Drove down to the Mercury because I realised it was a journalist. And got the journo who was on night duty, whom I knew quite well, to kind of revise and rewrite the story and put a different contextual emphasis on some of my words. It still resulted in a ministerial the next day, so at 8 minutes, 8:30 plus 10 seconds, I was hauled into the regional director's office and we had to write a retraction. And that stopped short of my being sued for defamation again. And we know, we've seen only on Monday in the place across the way from here, someone who'd been vilified deliberately in the Senate by Senator Bill Heffernan, who asserted that Michael Kirby was using a car for the purposes of trawling the cross, in particular the wall, looking for rough sex, and produced a car ticket which he may have, or he may or may not have known was a fake, but produced this in the Senate to vilify Kirby. And he was vilifying Kirby because Heffernan's views on sexuality and men in high places didn't accord with the sexuality of Kirby as a man in a high place. And he got away with it. And Kirby, to his credit, when Heffernan was forced to back down, went to Heffernan and said, "No worries, mate. I've been used to this all my life. You're still a friend." So, you're right. Defamation is powerful. I'm privy to an enormous number of secrets about public and private life in Wollongong, and I've speculated with my colleague Henry Lee. We both did our PhDs at this university, and long before Channel 9 stole from us the word underbelly, we had wanted to write a history of Wollongong, the alternative history of Wollongong, not the one edited by Hagan and Wells, sponsored by Wollongong City Council, and even though there's a brilliant chapter in that on the Garden of New South Wales by G. Mitchell, there is an alternative view of Wollongong, an alternative view which sees Mr. O'Brien from O'Brien's Road shooting Aboriginals and getting away with it in Wollongong Court because the judge says, well, someone's got to take the garbage out, and Mr. O'Brien, you did a good job, and the place still is called O'Brien's Road, which sees the blind point as having Aboriginals pushed off the top. And it's no longer sublime at all. It was a sublime piece of genocide as opposed to a sublime view, and other things which I won't go into. And Henry and I have argued that if we wrote what we know, we would either end up in the bottom of a building, or we'd be going to the witness protection program, or we'd be relocating to Kazakhstan. And that annoys me hugely, because as an historian, like my little celluloid heroes that I mentioned in State of Play, All the President's Men, and 3 Days of the Condor, I would like to get the truth out there. Kind of can't do it. I don't know how to get around it. Changing the defamation laws is sort of like trying to get the sun to rise in the west instead in the east. It's a little bit difficult, a little bit beyond me, a little bit beyond the law faculty at this university. But you're right. The defamation laws, and we may now have the opportunity, if Harry Evans doesn't come, of getting someone from law to come in and maybe talk about this and the practicalities of negotiating a way around the defamation laws to try and answer the question. But you're right, defamation is a huge problem. There are many people in this room who are privy to all sorts of information which, if they were revealed tomorrow in the Mercury, no one would be turning up for election next Monday, because they'd all be charged or disappeared or arrested and put on remand, or all of the above. So yes, defamation is a powerful disincentive to reveal the truth, and when applied to innocent people, as Michael Ryan was in the Illawarra Area Health Service in 1989 and 1990, resulted in a broken, destroyed and financially broke man, even though he used the same words that I had used in a radio interview. So I'm wondering, are there any questions from, we might work our way up the coast, so are there any questions from Bega? Right, but after we have the question from here. Okay, go. Up front and centre. We get you on camera.
Katrina, I love the idea, you say we should question our assumptions. But my point might be that generally, the general public, and we don't. We enjoy our assumptions. We buy newspapers that make us feel comfortable. If the shop jock makes us unhappy, we stop listening to him, or we stop buying that newspaper. So the newspapers are mitigated by, or their content is mitigated by public acceptance. Where do you think the internet might take us? Thank you.
Internet filters, perhaps, Katrina?
No, we'll leave the internet filter to another day, perhaps, and people who are far more specialised in that than me. The internet, yes. Well, there's been a lot of discussion about the internet and where it may take us. I'm a bit ambivalent about the internet from a media perspective. I think that in many respects it's a very powerful tool, because it's allowing people to actually provide their counter-narratives. And, for instance, certain bloggers will have quite a following. There are quite a number of sites that are popping up which are sort of counter-news sites, if you like, which are providing opinion. It's all cast in the frame of editorial, so people feel that they have far more liberty in what they can say. But at the same time, I wonder what it does to the impact of quality news journalism and of reporting of accuracy and truth and all those sorts of things. It's far more immediate, obviously, than your print media and than your broadcast media. So I'm a bit ambivalent about it. I have, mixed feelings about whether it's actually going to take us to a good place or it's taking us to a bad place. I guess if I declare my hand as a journalist, it makes me worry about my future as a future trade, because you'll note that there's quite often been cuts in recent years to journalists within major corporations, news outlets. And a lot of it is going online, and a lot of it is actually going towards freelance. And I think, like a lot of things, not just media and journalism, there are people who are claiming to be experts who possibly don't have the credentials to be claiming that they're experts. So I think there's two sides to where the internet is going to take us.
Katrina, can you give some examples of that where people are claiming to be experts and are not experts?
Well, in the field of IT, for example, if we move beyond journalism, if you look at IT, there's very much a trend towards people who have perhaps put their website up and they've done their own website, now saying that they're an expert in social media, or they've gone on Facebook, or they've gone on MySpace and they're now an expert in social media. There's a lot of people who are starting to do their own blogs, and they're writing their opinions, which I think is great. You need to have that diversity of viewpoint. But I just wonder what's happening to the reputation and the profession of journalism. In terms of examples, I'm not going to name specific ones because I'm just nailing my colours to the flag then, aren't I? But there's a few alternative news websites which have come up, and sadly, actually, some of those people are journalists who are contributing to it. But they're also just getting people who want to voice an opinion, you know. And I think that there's different mediums and different forums for doing all of that. But casting that as journalism per se, I put a question mark over. What was that, sorry?
I said Illawarra Ruminet.
Oh, right, okay. Illawarra Ruminet for everybody in the satellite campuses. Is there anybody else in a satellite campus who has a question before we come back to Wollongong?
Yes,
Oh, hold on, we'll go Bega first. Yes, you're on.
It's kind of surprising that your focus was on the KEC program Four Corners. I'd like to know what your idea of quality journalism is, and how does something like Fox Channel, Fox News, for example, fit into that criteria?
Fox. Well, I have to say I haven't watched a lot of Fox. Unfortunately, I'm an impoverished PhD student. Unfortunately, I'm dictated by budget and not able to access Fox. But the little bits that I've seen, I think it leaves a lot of question marks. In terms of quality journalism, if you look at the Code of Ethics, there's a set of guidelines which I think are very broad, but I think that they have, in principle, a great starting point for quality journalism. I mean, as a journalist myself, I was always very conflicted. You know, if we're going back to media production and processes, journalists face, as I said, strictures with deadlines, etc., but there's still a commercial imperative. And as a business journalist, I was working on trade publications, which you might think aren't necessarily as important as Sydney Morning Herald or, you know, your Daily Telegraph. But it's more important in terms of the bottom line for those publications and their survival. So as a journalist, I quite often came up against situations where you would have to try and maintain an integrity of a level of independence and some integrity about your reporting and what stories you wanted to feature and what stories you thought your audience wanted to read about versus what your salesperson or marketing person for the magazine was telling you should be featuring because it was going to bring in the big bucks from advertisers. So I think that there is a constant need for reflexivity. Quality journalism must have that. It must be accurate. It must be considerate of others. It must respect rights. It must also try and maintain some sort of push towards the truth, you know, truth and accuracy. It's amazing how many stories you read and they're just inaccurate or they're not well researched. Fact-checking, I think, has gone out the window for journalism. You know, and as a working journalist, you know, you can understand it because it's quite difficult when you're having your resources slashed and your budget slashed and you keep getting told it's your bottom line, your P&L that matters as to whether you keep your job. It's very hard to still see straight as to what you put into your magazine that has integrity and independence as an editorial. You know, advertorials, for example, were really creeping in when I was a business news editor. And you know, you're constantly facing this battle where you're trying to flag these sorts of paid editorials to your readers, so you're being upfront, so you're being transparent with your readers. I mean, I think there's got to be a level of honesty and engagement with your readership that also defines quality journalism. I mean, there's a whole list of things that you could go through. And, you know, that's possibly why there's no code of ethics which is very specific and is enforced from a legislative and a regulatory point of view, because it's very broad. I think there's a number of things that define quality journalism, but that's just a few of them. I think it's also about courage to some extent. It's courage to be able to stand up and say, no, this is what we're going to do in the interests of our readership, or in the interests of this story, or in the interests of revealing a truth, you know. Who else did we have from the...
Would not the truth be more obvious in the media if we had more independent media rather than corporate control media?
Yeah, well, you know, this goes back to the two sides of the internet. I mean, the internet is allowing independent media to prop up and flourish. And I think it goes back to what I was saying before. We need to question our assumptions, we need to be reflexive, and we also need to be willing to look at other positions and starting points, you know, starting points that differ from ours. And, you know, just personally, I mean, I'm really quite disappointed and discouraged with the state of the media in Australia, if I'm very honest about it. I don't see, as I said before, investigative journalism happening anymore. What is presented as a scoop on one channel is, you know, pilfered by another channel as an equal scoop. And what you read on Sydney Morning Herald quite often appears on the morning shows, and then it appears on the evening news, you know. So I wonder where the resources have gone, or where the integrity has gone for journalists to actually go out there and research and fact check and be investigative. And so you may well be right. Things like the internet and independent journalism, provided it adheres still to those guidelines of quality journalism, may well provide a different counterpoint. And it may provide a point where commercial media organisations will have to lift their game.
If you talk about quality journalism and truth, and you add another factor to it, how much news journalists are paid, then consider the following. This morning, after yesterday I had a very bad day, partly because of the stress of dealing with Michael Kirby on Monday, and dealing with a lot of distraught students and parents yesterday. And I woke up this morning about 3 o'clock and I didn't go back to sleep. So when I finally dragged myself out of bed and put the television on, and there was a choice between watching Stoke City play Fulham live, Stoke 1-3-2, it was a very good game, or watch the news headlines at 7:30 on Channel 7. My wife insisted that we watch the news headlines on Sunrise program on Channel 7. After we get over the weather and we get over the extensive number of ads, we have an interview with a guy who lost 45 kilos with some sort of miracle diet. It turned out it really wasn't a miracle diet. He just stopped eating crap and he started exercising. And it was prefaced by this. So I've forgotten the guy's name, we'll call him Mike. So Mike, I see you had a dedicated plan which involved a lot of gym work. And the dedicated plan and a series of specific goals with some heavy gym work. Mike, who's being interviewed live from Townsville, said, well, I didn't really have any specific goals, and I didn't have a detailed game plan. The journalist is on $250,000, right? He's already made one huge error. He's not researched. Now, I know this is 7:35 in the morning, right? And like, who gives a? And is it serious journalism? Probably not.
That was what I was going to say. Can we call them a journalist?
But they're being paid $250,000 per annum. But he didn't get that right. And then when we get on to, and he says, I don't like the gym. I don't go to the gym very often. So the prefacing comments by the journalist were wrong. A, he didn't have a big game plan. B, he didn't have a lot of goals. And C, he didn't go to the gym a lot. He's on $250,000. This is at 7:35. I then went over to watch Stoke play Fulham.
But the irony in that is that it's probably not even the journalist who has devised those questions. It's some researcher who, who has produced it.
On the other hand, the internet is a double-edged sword. It is cutting a swathe through print media big time. People, consumers of print media, are falling off. Newspapers are closing at a rapid rate in the US of A, and my guess is that this will happen in Australia. The more people go to online, which is why Murdoch now wants it A, copyrighted and B, paid for, so you and I can't dial up Sydney Morning Herald, smh.com.au and read what's in the hard copy. He doesn't want that. So that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, if it hadn't been for the internet, if it's not for the internet, in the last election you mightn't have had Get Up, which made an interesting contribution to the democratic process, nor would we be finding out what's going on in Iran. Now, if it wasn't for a group of very well-educated people with very slick blackberries, blueberries, whatever sort of mulberries they are, I don't have one, doing video filming and putting it on the net, we wouldn't have the poor information that we've got about Iran that we currently have. On the other hand, the use of that is a little bit hypocritical. In the recent case of the tragedy at Bateman's Bay, where the tanker, the petrol tanker clobbered the family car, resulting in at least 4 deaths and a mother fighting for her life, 2 things occurred. First of all was the shock horror revelations by all news media outlets that some people stopped, didn't help anyone burning to death in the car, but filmed it on their cell phones. The next day, that very footage is screened on the same channels that had previously, the night before, screamed shock horror. So the internet it's got a lot to answer for, but it's probably got a lot going for it. But I think for those of us that have been used to the hard copy, getting the paper over the fence of a morning or going to the newsagents or whatever and buying a newspaper, we're probably dinosaurs. I think the print journalism doesn't have the golden future that it might have had in the 30s, 40s or 50s, which has got interesting implications for investigative journalism and thus might have interesting implications for truth. I'll go and sit down.
Just to round that out though, I mean, personally, I still think there is a difference between print media and their online versions. I mean, if anyone looks at Sydney Morning Herald, for example, I don't know whether that's journalism or it's just infotainment. Yet what you'll find in the print version of that particular paper is vastly different. But once again, if you want immediacy of news, not necessarily quality or accuracy, but immediacy, you're going to hit the Sydney Morning Herald website. So, was there another question from one of the satellite campuses before we come back to Wollongong? Who haven't we?
Mossvale has a question.
Yes, Mossvale.
Oops. Oh, good. A question. I'm taking it right back to the beginning with the mental health patients and the police. One thing that came out of the Victorian years ago was the fact that the police were taught to shoot to kill. Is that still relevant? Because the media could have played a huge part in that. The police were actually taught to shoot to kill, not to wound. And this man was at a distance, he only had a knife, and yet he was shot full on in the chest and killed.
And this is one of the very thorny issues around this particular topic.
But a very important one for the media to play, that they focus on that, which the public should be aware of that and have a say in it.
Yeah. Look, my understanding is that it's not classified as shoot to kill. It's about shooting at an object in the broadest part, which is the torso. But inevitably, let's face it, if you get a few bullets in your torso, it is probably shoot to kill. But it's certainly not presented in those terms by the police. And, this comes back to spin once again. So, I do think, and I'm saying this as a personal level, there is very much a need to start talking about that. And that is starting to now play out in public discourse with, first of all, it was about talk about capsicum spray, obviously, as an alternative, and now it's very much about tasers. So there is very much a discourse around lethal force and what is defined by lethal force and shoot to kill, you know, in terms of training for police. And there's very much a discourse around what alternatives are there to firearms in terms of dealing with people who may not necessarily be mentally ill, but might be, you know, disturbed in some other form, you know, be it not schizophrenia in a psychotic episode, for example, but a psychotic episode that might be brought on by, you know, drug or alcohol abuse or whatever it may be. So there is, yeah, there's very much, that discourse is starting to happen, but I don't know whether that in itself has even had any balance to it, especially in terms of tasers, and I don't know whether these things have been researched well enough. If you look at a report which was released, I think it was last year, by the New South Wales Ombudsman, they actually recommended that the New South Wales Police Force hold off for another 2 years before issuing tasers to general duty police officers, because there's not enough known about tasers as an alternative to other training. I think personally, beyond all of that, there's a lot to be said for discussing about specialist training of police in terms of communication and negotiation before we even get to drawing a firearm, before we even get to drawing a taser or capsicum spray. All right.
I have one more question here.
Is that Mossvale still?
Yes, it is. What does a journalist do? They actually find the truth, but are gagged by bosses or organisations. Where do you go to get that truth told?
A pseudonym and on the internet, I'd suggest. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. And there are people who have decided to take their personal opinions on to the internet in those sorts of forms. I mean, if anyone remembers the fake Stephen Conroy on, was it Twitter? It was actually an employee of Telstra who was making comments about IT policy and IT issues through the guise of Stephen Conroy, who's the minister for that particular area. And he was outed as the fake Stephen Conroy. People were reading it and thinking Stephen Conroy had, you know, forgotten to take his medication, and was eventually outed as a Telstra employee, and he was sacked. So it's very difficult for journalists when they find truth to speak out. You know, I don't think we're in the same era as, you know, all the president's men anymore. I think it's very difficult. But there are other ways in which you can, you know, under different guises, different forms, ways in which you can actually express personal opinion and truth.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katrina. As a lawyer who's represented the mentally ill for about 20 years, and including forensic patients, I was obviously very fascinated by your lecture, and thank you. Just a very 2 or 3 points. In terms of defamation, if you want to become a lawyer in the near future, I suggest you specialise in defamation and the internet, because lawyers will make a fortune out of defamation on the internet because it's also relaxed and loose, and I think that's going to be a growing part of the law. In terms of the Four Corners clip that Katrina showed us, there was a question about how can they talk about the upcoming coroner's inquest before it's held. And, you know, these people on the clip will be real witnesses in that coroner's inquest. My personal view, and it's only my opinion, is that yes, they can talk about it. So if you think about famous murder cases or horrific crimes of violence, Alan Jones doesn't hold back, the newsprint doesn't hold back, television doesn't hold back. Well, just after people are charged or a person is charged, and the media forms its own view about their guilt or otherwise well before the trial is held. And that's why in a town like Wollongong, which is still a relatively small place, that lawyers often ask for a transfer of trials from Wollongong to Sydney because of all the media publicity that a particular murder or horrific crime has taken place. So that's my opinion anyway. Glenn also mentioned a few Hollywood movies in terms of journalistic presentations and media coverage. Another one I highly recommend is Good Night and Good Luck, which portrays, certainly in a certain period of time in the United States, portrays a group of very, very courageous journalists who took on Joe McCarthy. And you can get that at the video shop. As I said, I've represented forensic patients for many years, and they are usually people found not guilty on the grounds of mental illness, of murders and very serious crimes. And if you go and look at the statistics, those people are actually locked up for much longer than people who commit murders and plead guilty, because you are only released, if you're found not guilty on the grounds of mental illness, you're only released after many, many years after going through a very tight review by the Mental Health Review Tribunal, certainly in this state. So coming to my question. Katrina, I'm just wondering, Alan Jones is not going to listen to us if we phone and say, look, you know, you're not portraying this story the right way. This mentally ill person has been treated in such a way by the police and so forth. And we can write letters to the editor, but isn't the ultimate answer reform through Parliament, so that you make it mandatory that where there's a shooting such as we had at Berkeley a few years ago, where a mentally ill man walks out on his porch having set his house ablaze behind him, and I think he was shot dead. Couldn't we couldn't the law, a statute say, well look, when there's a situation like that, you must throw a cordon 3 kilometres around that and prevent the media from entering that space. Because I think the policies that you mentioned, journalistic policies and guidelines, no one really listens to them. Alan Jones breaches them almost daily, and he gets hit over the hand, gets a fine of $1,000.
Yep. The case that you mentioned is actually a case study that I'm looking at as part of my research. And the situation, for those who may not be familiar with that case, is that a cordon wasn't established, and the media were able to access the site, which was in full view of neighbours and that sort of thing as well. And they took extensive footage and also photos, which were then published and, as I said, reproduced on numerous occasions, and it was quite graphic. And the front page of the Illawarra Mercury showed the individual, who was not at the time actually deceased, but the banner read "shot dead," so you know you were drawing those conclusions. Showed that person in full view with no obscurity of face or anything like that, and that was on the front page. Incidentally, when I asked why that photo was on the front page versus a photo of a man being pulled out of the surf who was deceased, I was told because if it bleeds, it leads. Which I thought you only read about in textbooks about journalism. I didn't think that there were journalists who actually subscribed to that principle. It's interesting as a sideline to, you're talking about political reform for these sorts of events. One of my interests is also in the fact that these events do go through a coronial process. And more often than not, there are very specific recommendations handed down by coroners for improvements in police response, and in this case it was also about media reporting of these types of incidents. The problem as I see it is that I want to know where these recommendations go, because there's no legislation which would make those recommendations enforceable either by police or by media or whoever it may be. And quite often these recommendations are very considered, they're very measured, and they're viable in 9 times out of 10, you know, and they're fundamentally important. Yet they seem to just go into an ether. There's no obligation to actually adhere to those recommendations. So while I'm not sure about political reform, I mean, my understanding is that there is some obligation to form a cordon around those sorts of events. But what do you do with people who've got telescopic lenses on cameras and that sort of thing? You know, it's still coming back to a question of, do we actually legislate for regulation around media practices, or how, if we don't, how do we enforce self-regulation by the media, so those events aren't presented in the way that they were presented. But I think the other broader question is also about coronial processes and what happens in terms of trying to enforce those recommendations which are handed down. Yeah.
What is the difference between this case in Wollongong and everything we get to see and to hear every day in Pakistan or Africa or England, as far as emotion, that they are playing on emotion and on I don't know.
You mean the media are playing on emotion? Yeah.
See, we are making a little thing out of a bloke being shot here in Wollongong, and everybody, families, the children, and everybody, morning, midday, and evening, you get.
I agree with you. I agree with you that is. It's equally important that we hear about that, and it's as much a trauma. This is at a local level. I guess that's at a broader, global, international level. But I still think it's important that we start talking about these incidents, because this is not just about some guy in Wollongong who gets shot. It's about, for me, I'm very passionate about the fact that it's about systemic failures, and that's not being covered. We keep getting the narratives about this person's violent and, in this instance, in this case study that we were talking about, the media actually said he deserved to be shot. He was out of control, he was a monster, and he deserved to be shot. Well, we need to have some sort of rhetoric about that, because that has broader implications for people's assumptions about mental illness and people who are mentally ill. But on the flip side, if we're just laying the blame at the feet of police who do fire, in these sorts of situations, and I think there's an argument to be made that maybe we need to think about what we would be like in that situation. Particularly if we didn't know much about mental illness, we didn't have the requisite training, we didn't have the requisite resources. I think that there's sometimes an imperative by media to be too quick to blame without looking at the context. So there's still issues there around the mental health system in Australia, whether it is failing, which I think it is, failing mental health consumers, what we can do about that, whether there is political reform that needs to happen around that. So I think there's still issues which are fundamentally important to the way that we live and how Australia is governed, and what we're doing for, the human rights of people in terms of...
Isn't there a psychological aspect in it too? See, if I'm as an old soldier, I'm thinking back of the brotherhood, which exists the same with the police. You are being taught something to keep together, And
well, there's a lot we could say about police culture, but I think that's probably a whole other lecture in its own right.
Might have one more question, Mark.
I'm happy for you to repeat it. Do you think a statute of rights, particularly related to dignity of the mental ill, would actually have an effect on this sort of coverage? And have you looked at any models of, like the British or police who are not armed, dealing with mental health patients?
Yeah. Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah. There's something
Yeah.
I'd like to say that keeps on getting missed. Doesn't matter who's talking, whether it's the police or nurses or whatever. When somebody is having an episode, it's like a schizophrenic episode, what is happening there is you're faced with a sudden eruption of an extraordinary energy. Nobody knows what to do about it. Nobody knows how to go about it. It's an eruption. It's like a volcano. If you're there in a professional capacity, you're listening with everything in your body as to what's going to happen, how to move about it. It takes a lot of training, it takes a lot of experience. The worst thing you can do about it is get a couple of ambulance men or policemen to come in and hold him down.
Yeah.
The best I've seen it handled is by 5'1" little nurses coming and twittering around somewhere. Somehow that happens. But it's that sort of thing that's not understood.
And that's why I make mention...
In your case history, which I thought was very well done, certainly, but nobody was at fault there because everybody was scared witless.
Yeah, and look, I've given you a snapshot of what I could have actually said about these sorts of events. There's a lot more that can be said about police culture, about discretion in those sorts of events, also about adrenaline that's going through people who are trying to respond to those sorts of events. There's also, that's right, each case is very much different. But I still think that there is something to be said, and I think you're alluding to it, something to be said for communication and negotiation skills and that training.
I can use the phrase, and I might use what is bleeding obvious.
Yes, what is bleeding obvious, that's right.
We've missed out on the last 3 questions. We haven't heard a word of the discussion or a word of the question, so we're left right out of it.
There was a question, John, and then there was
a comment.
A commentary on the question which added to the question, and I was just about to go back and repeat Mark's question because he said he doesn't want to come to the front, he wants me to repeat the question. So Mark's question was, if I can remember it, was something about is there something to be said for the a Bill of Rights or a code of dignity for those who are having a mental episode, either before, during and after they may or may not have been shot fatally or not by the police. The earlier question by Hans was a question about goes to the issue of the psychological aspects of this and the brotherhood of the police and the bonding together of police people under all sorts of pressures and circumstances to form what we could loosely call police culture. That would take another 5 PhDs. We're running out of time, but I think we can get Katrina to deal with a possible code of ethics of dignity for the mentally ill.
In principle, yes, I agree, but I still think that it needs to be done in tandem with greater education around mental health as an issue. And that's going back to that idea about questioning our assumptions. I think that, we can have those sorts of protocols and guidelines in place and those sorts of rights in place, but we still need people to sign up to it, and we still need some sort of education so that people understand the importance of that and the real significance of that. There's a UN Declaration of Rights which obviously covers people who have disabilities and mental health issues. I don't know how effective that's been. So I think there's still a lot to be said for questioning our assumptions and for greater education around these issues. And yes, that being done in tandem with some sort of political reform.